Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our second session in a series of 6 for our Summit and Oregon Business Plan theme of shared prosperity. My name's Joth Rickey. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to chair our Oregon Business Plan Committee and work with a great team of leaders across our state to be thinking about what the future lies ahead in the next decade, the challenges we need to overcome, and the wins we need to put on the board to move our economy forward. I'd like to welcome everyone and remind you that this is part of a series that we're replacing our typical summit with that we usually have in December. However, we'll have a revised look to that program for you as we look ahead to mid-December of this year. It'll just be online and we won't be able to see your smiling faces at the Oregon Convention Center. We're excited for today's session that's focused on trends and their implications for Oregon's recovery. With the bigger picture, we're really looking towards shared prosperity for our entire state, not just in one section or the other, whether it's a rural community, a particular community of color, or if it's a major metro area or a small town. Shared prosperity for all is our theme and something that we're working on, and we'll talk about a little bit more today with our speakers. At our first session on July 28th, we introduced the framework and began the conversation about what it will take to come out of this pandemic, and with the economy that is more resilient and equitable. Obviously, with what we've seen in the last 3 weeks in Oregon, with our devastation in Southern Oregon, our towns up and down the western slope of the Cascades, and the smoke and the challenges that created for several businesses across our communities, we have much work ahead of us to recover from what's been an eventful year of 2020. And distinct from reopening, which is more immediate, our focus on the business plan is on recovery. And over the next several years, how do we return to, then blow past basically pre-pandemic levels of our economy and look to prosperity and equity? Shared prosperity is our focus here, and it must be, as we talked about in July. The pandemic is highlighting deeply entrenched economic and racial inequities, as we'll hear from our speakers today, stand to only worsen without intention. And that's really not the Oregon we want. We often think of ourselves as a welcoming place and one of opportunity for all, but honestly, the data doesn't necessarily bear that out. This is our chance to change that story. And when I say our chance, we mean everybody. This will require all of our leaders, all of our elected officials, all of our various teachers and superintendents and people who care so much about where we live and what we do. This is our chance to engage and do this together. Today we'll hear from Steve and Toya as the pandemic is acting as a great accelerator and a great unfreezer about the things that are happening. We're seeing new businesses pop up. We're seeing new opportunities for people. We're seeing changes. Along with the devastation that's happened, there are lights that are starting to open up to give us opportunity for our future. When we look back on this moment years from now, we'll remember it as an inflection point for a host of significant trends and reflect real changes from pre-pandemic behavior. The rise of automation, the rise of remote work, the rise of telemedicine, the acceleration of e-commerce. How many people have ordered something to their door more than they did prior to March of 2020? And the repositioning of brick and mortar and how that will change as we look ahead. We'll also look back on it as something that laid bare to the deficiencies, ineffectiveness, and challenges of key institutions and systems, and creating perhaps a once-in-a-generation need and a moment for change. As we talked about on July 28th, this is our time. First up today, we'll have Steve Brown, aka the Bald Futurist, speaking about automation, the rise of anywhere workers, and how the crisis is creating potential for enormous, once-in-a-generation change. Then we'll hear from Toya Fick, chair of Meyer Memorial Trust and the executive director of Stand for Children, about what these trends mean for shared prosperity and the need to continue focusing on education reform to pull us out of this. Then we'll have a discussion with Steve and Toya that will prove to be very interesting. But before we hear from Steve and Toya, I want to get a word of thanks to our sponsors of the Oregon Business Plan. We're so grateful for the ongoing sponsorship support the business community has provided. Without this underwriting, we would not have been able to accomplish the work we have done to date. And I want to thank everybody who's been a part of that. We've had people that have renewed already for this virtual summit series, And we believe strongly in offering these a chance to access conversations as we move forward together in recovery for shared prosperity. So sign up, become a sponsor, and we'd love to have you participate in the conversation. I'd personally like to thank our wonderful sponsors: Bank of America, MJ Murdoch Charitable Trust, PAPE, ADEC, Dusky Goose, Oregon Business and Industry, Pacific Power and Portland General Electric, Kaiser Permanente, Northwest Natural, Ochoco Lumber Company, US Bank, and particularly my team at Dutch Bros for sponsoring the 2020 Leadership Summit Series. If you've not yet had a chance to renew your sponsorship or would like to be a new sponsor, please join us and contact the team at Oregon Business Council, and I'll let you know that we have people on the phones right now ready to take your call. So please call in. We'd love to have you. All right, so to get us started for today, I'm excited to welcome Steve Brown. And Steve, we talked about you earlier, AKA the Bald Futurist. You've led us on the Futurist ride for quite a while. What's going to be different about this one? Love to hear from you.
Okay, well, I'll do my best, Joth. It's great to be with you today, and thank you, everybody, for joining today. I hope that what we have lined up for you today is going to be useful, provide you some relevant information, be thought-provoking, and help us all build a plan to move Oregon forward. You can tell from my outrageous British accent that I'm not originally an Oregonian, but I moved here 23 years ago. I've made this my home. This is where I live with my wife. I live in central Portland, and it's been a tough time for us all. And we just seems like 2020, the punches keep coming. I'm just waiting for the killer chickens to drop from the sky and take us all. So it's been a tough time. And what I wanted to talk to you about today is how do we build resilience in our lives, in our companies, our organizations, and use innovation, and particularly technology innovation, to dig our way out of the current situation that we have found ourselves in. So I'm going to take you through a number of different things, but before I do that, I always want to address the weird thing in the room, which is I call myself a futurist. What is a futurist? So let's just get that out quickly. First thing is, futurists don't make predictions, so I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen in 2027. A futurist looks at trends, draws insights from those, and lets people know what will be possible in a certain time frame. So what are the trends I look at? Well, obviously technology trends. I look at business trends. How will business models change? How will businesses pay for these great technologies? How will those technologies change the way that businesses operate? But most importantly, I look at people trends. What do people care about? What are their aspirations in life? What are their fears? What are their relationships like? Which relationships are important? How do people like to create meaning in their lives? And from that, I derive this landscape, which I call a possibility landscape. What are the things that will be possible 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 1 year from now? And out of that, I help my clients figure out a digital innovation plan. How can they embrace digital technology to help them move their businesses forward and to do things that they couldn't do before, or to make their businesses more resilient? So what have I brought for you today? I wanted to bring 4 different things for you. The first is to offer some new ways, perhaps, of thinking about the current times that we are in and what's the opportunity that lies within those really dark and difficult times. The second thing is to characterize the current situation, really the COVID pandemic. I think it's important to understand it not as a monolithic event, but as what I call a 3-headed beast. I'll explain what I mean by that shortly. I'll then offer, just very briefly, an innovation framework that I have been developing. I'll share that with you. There's a version of it you can go download off my website if you're interested in that, just to help provoke some thinking on ways we might use technology to dig our way out of this difficult year. And then I'll offer some final thoughts on what do I think this means for us here in the state of Oregon. What should we do at an Oregonian level? And then what are some thoughts I have for Oregon businesses in particular, things that they might want to be doing. So you can get my magic clicker here. I see that by the power of technology, I have a clicker in my hand, which lets me move these slides forward. So I want to do it right. So three ways to think about our current times. And anybody that's heard me talking in the last few months has perhaps heard me talk about this before, but let me just give you some ways of thinking about the times that we're in. First of all, this has been a time of great reflection for us as on a personal level, particularly when we looked out of our windows and could see nothing but smoke and were worried that the fires might come to get us next, or we know people who are disrupted from their homes, or people who are watching this now who have lost their homes. I mean, just a terrible time that really has focused the mind for all of us on the fragility of society, the fragility of our lives, and really puts into focus and gives us great clarity on what our values are, what our priorities are, and from a company level as well, what the purpose of that company truly is. So I think this time of great reflection has also led to a lot more reflection about social issues in our country as well, not just about the state of our lives, but the state of other people's lives and what we can do to advance all of our situations. So it's certainly a time of great reflection where we have realized there is a lack of resilience in our society and in the way that we've structured the world. And I think there is therefore a much greater openness for change than there has ever been. I'll talk about that more in a moment. The second thing is this has been the great acceleration. What I mean by that is things that were going to happen anyway have happened much more quickly. I've had a number of clients come to me and say, Steve, I need your help. Here's my 5-year business plan. These are the things I was going to do 5 years from now. I need to do them this year. Can you help me? So there's this appetite to speed up, certainly digital transformation, embracing digital technology to reach customers in new ways, automation efforts, because quite candidly, robots don't get sick and robotic delivery vehicles don't carry disease, but generally to use innovation, to accelerate innovation efforts to dig our way out of economic downturn. And things that were going to happen anyway, companies that were failing slowly and painfully have gone out of business more quickly. Companies that were on the rise have shot up like a rocket. Think Amazon versus JCPenney, for example. So the great acceleration is certainly well underway. The third lens I'd offer is this idea of the great defrosting. What I mean by this is that many organizations are frozen in place for a wide variety of reasons. It could be reasons of tradition, so think about the educational sector. It could be for reasons of regulation, so the healthcare sector is rightly regulated to try and save people's lives and stop us doing stupid things. But it could be just a culture of complacency, risk aversion. It just became a momentum in an inertia in a company, but it keeps things kind of frozen in place. What COVID has done, and I think what other shock events to our society have done, is that they have enabled and emboldened change agents, and they have given us a reason that we all have to embrace change at a much more rapid rate. I'll give you examples. In the educational sector, the embracing of distance learning. Now, is it perfect? No, but it's certainly something that has been a bridge to help us to educate kids even when we all had to remain socially distanced. I think you're going to see that continue to be at least an ingredient in the education system going forward. Should it be the exclusive way we educate kids? No. There's real value in having them together in physical spaces. Can it be a complement that allows kids and students to get access to the very best teachers, even if they're not inside the walls of the physical institution they're attending? Yeah, that may be a good complement. So I think you'll see that we're never going to go back to January 2020, right? This defrosting is going to mean that we'll move into a different space, and eventually this will freeze into a new shape. And the question is, what's that shape going to be? I'll give you another example from the medical industry. In 2019, the total number in the United States of telehealth visits, people using their phones to speak to their doctor, was about 50 million visits last year. We are on track, according to Forrester Research, to have almost 1 billion telehealth visits in 2020. Now, that's not appropriate, again, for all doctor visits. So sometimes you need to be there physically. But for many, it's a much better and more efficient way to see your doctor. So I doubt that we will go back to 50 million visits in 2021 or 2022 or whenever this is all behind us. So you put all this together, this reflection, acceleration, defrosting. This is actually a time of opportunity to drive change, needed change into the way that we do things. If you think about these times as a pressure test, right? They're a way to pressure test our institutions, our society, companies, and see where the holes are, see where the problems are, so that we can focus on addressing those as best we can now. That won't just get us through these difficult times, it will make our institutions, our companies stronger when we come out of the other side. So there is opportunity during challenging times. If you look at what happened to the world in World War II, amazing things came out of what was a horrific time, with incredible loss of life and dignity. But out of that came modern air travel, satellites, GPS. We didn't have Uber today without the things that were invented in World War II. Antibiotics were first delivered at scale for the Normandy landing. So when there are difficult times, and we're clearly in difficult times now, that can be when we as humanity are at our best. So let's figure out and put our heads together on how we can do things better. I mentioned before that a way to think about the pandemic is not as this monolithic beast that we all have to slay. It is actually, I believe, a three-headed beast. There are three heads to this crisis. The first one is the public health crisis that we hear reflected in the news every day. The second is an operational crisis. This is businesses, transport organizations, cities having trouble operating as they normally would because of the need to maintain social distance. So retailers are struggling, restaurants are struggling really badly, and so on. So there's an operational crisis. And then out of that comes an economic crisis. So each of these, they're very interconnected, of course, but they are separate and distinct crises. It's important to understand that, because each crisis requires a different strategic response. So what are those? Well, for the public health crisis, you need a health and safety response, distancing and masks and contact tracing and ultimately vaccines. Not going to spend any time on that because that's the kind of stuff we already know about. At least I hope we do by now. It's been on the news so much. For operational things, we need to build businesses that are more resilient, that can operate despite challenges in having people come to physical premises, or being able to make it easy for customers to contact us for our operations to continue as best we can. And not all businesses can do that, but many can and have been making great strides here. And then finally, the best way to come out of an economic downturn on a growth path is not to save your way out of a recession. You can't save your way out of a recession. You have to innovate and invest your way out of a downturn. So let's expand on these a little bit more. I already mentioned that the health and safety components. Behind building resilience, there are a number of different things that my clients are certainly looking at on how they build increased resilience into their businesses. And we have to build increased resilience into our state as well. So the first one is financial resilience. Do you have a balance sheet? Do you have a loan structure that lets you continue to pay workers even if you have to have a few step aside for a time here and there? Do you have contracts that give you the flexibility you need to flex them as you need to if financial times change? Do you have organizational resilience? Meaning, do you have cross-training in place? So if someone needs to step aside because they're sick, you can have someone step into their place and continue operations. Do you have the ability to have succession planning, so that if someone leaves the company, you know exactly who's going to step into their shoes day one, and they're already pre-trained to fill that role? Do you have, if you have a large organization, are you geographically distributed? So if something happens on a local basis, as a local disaster, as we've seen lately with fires, maybe other parts of the business can continue to function. Operational resilience is thinking about, do you have the channels in place? Do you have the capabilities in place to operate at distance if you need to? So companies that had already invested in digital infrastructure and had digital means of delivering products to services, communicating with customers, they have fared much better during these times than those that didn't, which brings you to the next thing, which is digital infrastructure resilience. Do you have cybersecurity measures in place? Do you have a failover system for your digital infrastructure to make sure that your IT is rock solid and you've got multiple nines of uptime, as it's called in that sector, to make sure you can be resilient there? Do you have supply resilience? Do you have multiple suppliers in multiple locations so you're not reliant on one core supplier that if they, for some reason, are not able to deliver to you for a day or a week or a month or perhaps forever, that you can continue to not disrupt your supply to your customers. And finally, business resilience. Do you have the right products and services and channels for the right time? And as the market conditions change, are you able to adapt rapidly? And that's partly a cultural construct as well. So finally, on the third head of the beast, I said, the best way out of an economic downturn is through investment and innovation. And I want to offer you some ways of thinking about innovation. And really, to me, there are 5 main parts of a business or an organization that you can think about driving innovation into. The first one is your offering, your products, your services, the experience you deliver. How could you use technology to improve your offer? The second is the channels that you have. So what are the channels that you use to develop, to deliver products through? How could you reach new customers, new markets through new channels? Thirdly, your workforce, not looking to use technology necessarily to automate away your workforce. There's some benefits in some small areas there, but really the best benefits in using technology for your workforce is to use it to elevate your workforce, to help increase their capabilities, to make them not just more productive and more efficient, the way we've been thinking about the last 40 years, but also to think about how to make them more creative, to help them be more intuitive, to help them make higher quality decisions, to have better judgment. There are now artificial intelligence-based technologies that can help us to do that. To improve our operations, to make them more streamlined and more efficient. And finally, we can use technology to create entirely new business models and to develop new revenue streams along the way. So I'll come to those thoughts in a few minutes. But first of all, I want to tell you, what are the technologies that are going to help us get to this place? What's the new cool stuff from Future Boy here? All right, so in order to explain what's coming, it's worth just remembering where we've come from. So if this gray box on the screen here represents all of the business problems that are out there, only a small fraction of them could be solved using PCs and web technology. It was about just over 10 years ago that we saw the launch of 2 big new technologies, mobile technologies, these things, and cloud technology, the ability for companies to use and scale internet capabilities on the back end to work these things at very low cost and make it easy for them to scale their businesses. Very powerful, and the combination of those, along with the PC and web, allowed us to solve even more business problems than we could before. But there's still a lot that we can't solve today. But the next range of technologies, which has now started to be referred to in this terminology, spatial computing, computing that understands physical space and that can interact and connect the physical world with the digital world much more intimately. These technologies are going to solve a whole new set of problems that were just not possible to solve before, business problems. What are these technologies? These are the 6 spatial computing technologies, which I wrote about in my most recent book. Artificial intelligence, I'll run them through them one by one. So artificial intelligence, a new type of computing. It's not what you see in the movies, far from it. It's a type of computing that allows computers, instead of you having to give them rules in a program on how to solve a problem, it allows you to teach them by showing them examples, and then the AI figures out its own rules. So it's a different way of solving problems. And it allows you to solve problems that you could not solve with previous types of computers. That's what's given us the voice interfaces, self-driving cars, and so on. Satellite and 5G networks I'll talk about in a few minutes. I'll skip over that, but that's the connectivity that's going to connect all of these great experiences together. Augmented reality is if you've experienced virtual reality, where you put on a headset, you're transported to a different time and place, you feel like you've been zoomed somewhere else. Could be a different planet, could be a different part of the world, could be inside a video game. Great technology, but it disconnects you from the physical world around you. Augmented reality allows you to put on a pair of glasses, see the world around you, stay connected to the physical space around you, but see digital objects and information overlaid in that space. That's much more useful, much more interesting in business contexts. For example, in manufacturing, where you need to see the machinery you're working with, but have information that shows you in the moment what to do next. Blockchain technology is sort of a rather esoteric technology. It's associated with cryptocurrencies, but it does far more than that. It will help us to make our supply chains more efficient, more transparent. It will help us to smooth transactions and remove intermediaries from transactions, which overall create economic growth. the Internet of Things and sensors is being able to put sensors into everything and every piece of infrastructure, every piece of objects, so that the digital world understands what's happening in our physical world, and therefore we can make our world more responsive to human needs. That's fundamentally what that's going to deliver for us. And then finally, autonomous machines. This is everything from robots and drones, cobots, which are collaborative robots designed to work with humans, self-driving cars, self-driving trucks, and even passenger drones, scaled up drones that can carry people through the sky. So those are the technologies. Combined together, these are the spatial computing technologies. I have found it useful to think about these in terms of a matrix. I offered this to you in case it's useful for you to think through this too. So on the left-hand side of this matrix, you'll see the things I talked about as the 5 ways that I think we can innovate in our organizations. Along the top, you see those 6 technologies. At the intersection of each of those is an opportunity, in fact, multiple opportunities to drive innovation into your business, into everybody's business. Right? And you can think of them as being like the 6 technologies, the 6 new colors in your palette to allow you to drive innovation into your business, to create new revenue streams, to uplift your workers, to create new products and services and offerings, and so on. So you can see here on the chart, it's just zoomed up for you. There's an example at every intersection here. There's a version of this that I've put on my website, which you can download for free. You go to boldfuturist.com. It's actually a more detailed version. It's a little worksheet that you can use to help you think through and give you some starters on some of the opportunities that you might have to be able to embrace innovation in your business using these technologies. It can seem a little overwhelming, a lot of this technology. People can be scared of it, especially if you think about artificial intelligence. Oh my God, it's the end of the world. Robots are going to come and take our jobs and kill us all. That's not the reality of it. And the more you understand about this technology, the less you will fear it, and the more you will see its application to solve real problems for people and fundamentally problems for businesses. So that's the innovation framework. The final part of my conversation with you today is about what do we do in Oregon? How's this going to affect Oregon? So first of all, I want to talk about offices. Many of us now, including me, are working remotely. I'm most comfortable on a keynote stage in front of thousands of people, and here I am in my office at home, as many of us are. So what we found during this time is this actually works pretty well. And many managers who thought they needed to breathe down our necks and look over our shoulders to make sure we're working hard enough have realized actually they don't need to do that. It's exploded that myth. And so the question is now, well, what do we do going forward? Do we really need to come together in offices? Is this the end of offices? A commercial real estate project doomed? I think the answer is no. But what I expect is that the default here flips. It used to be, in the before times, that by default we would go into a place of work. And by exception, we would stay at home. We would talk to our supervisors and say, hey, I need to work at home today, kid's sick, or whatever it might be. But it was by exception. What we might see going forward is that for at least a category of workers, certainly this cannot be the case for all workers. Everybody's work condition is different. But for a portion of the workforce, the default will flip so that the norm will be that you work at home, and by exception, you go into the office. And why would you go into the office? Well, there's multiple reasons you go in. When you want to collaborate with other human beings, Zoom is fine, and Teams or whatever your platform of choice might be, but it's much easier to collaborate with other human beings when you're in the same physical space with them. Similarly, building relationships is much easier when you can meet someone in the cafeteria or meet them for a one-on-one for coffee. Humans like to connect, look each other in the eye, and Zoom just doesn't cut it. And then finally, the serendipity of being in the office, of running into somebody in the corridor and saying, hey, I've got an idea for you. And it's suddenly that exchange that you just don't get. It hasn't been solved for yet with the collaboration tools that we have today. So what a lot of companies are looking at is, okay, well, if I make this default change, what does that look like? What are our opportunities here? And a number of companies have already come out and said, they're going to reconfigure their office spaces. They're going to close some local offices. Some companies have said they're going to close big offices and actually build satellites instead. So different companies taking different strategies. But every business needs to have their own strategy. What's right for you? What's right for your employees? What's the level of flexibility you're able to offer? And how do you make it work as best you can for everybody? And how do you put the tools in place that you need to enable your employees to be as effective as possible when they're working from home? And what this is leading to is a new generation of workers, a new type of worker. We talk about remote workers. People are now talking about anywhere workers, workers that can work from anywhere on the planet. And so long as their work is completely transportable, what it allows you to do is to have workers anywhere in the world, as long as you can manage across the time zones. That means a new management approach. It means you have to manage people based on results rather than time with butt in seat. It means we're probably going to have to rethink pay policies, because you're now paying somebody to be remote, and you need to think about what's their cost of living where they are, and does that affect how much you pay them, or do you pay them local market rate for the people who are physically in your company in the same town as you? What it means is there's some real advantages here, though. First of all, for companies, instead of looking maybe in the 30 or 40 mile catchment zone around your office, people who are willing to make that commute, now you can start to look at people who work, the other side of the country, the other side of the world, and have access to a global talent pool so you can get the very best talent in your organization. It's also great for wealth projection. What I mean by that is these anywhere workers will go and live in places that they find compelling to live in. Could be Oregon. And those people are going to spend the dollars that they're earning in other states or in other countries, and they're going to spend it here in Oregon. How do we attract those people and ensure that wealth is being projected from other places into the state of Oregon, or perhaps people moving out of Portland or Salem or Eugene, moving more into rural environments, that we're projecting their wealth generation, that they're spending it in those local rural communities and spreading the wealth across the state of Oregon. So there's great opportunity here with these anywhere workers for us here in Oregon. And this is all being enhanced. I said I'd save later to talk about these networks. As we connect everybody together, there's a lot of talk about 5G networks. 5G is being rolled out, the 5th generation cellular networks being rolled out in all major cities today. It's going to give us 10 to 100 times the speed of the 4G that we use with our phones today. Some notable things to know about 5G networks. One, they're going to be much more resilient than the old networks. You get less drop calls. Two, it's the first network that's been designed specifically to connect devices that aren't just cell phones. So it's going to be used for connecting your home internet needs, for connecting machinery in factories, for connecting transportation devices, parking meters, you name it. And it is also something that's going to be fairly limited in cities to begin with. So what that means is if you're in a rural environment and you're in rural Oregon, you don't get to have the beauty and the benefit of 5G. You get, you get passed over again. So good news. This is for the rest of the world. A number of major entrepreneurs, notably Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and a few others, are all battling it out to build the next generation of satellite networks. These will connect you with high-speed internet anywhere on Earth. These are low Earth orbit satellites. SpaceX, which is Elon Musk's company, already has 700 of these satellites up in the air. There will be thousands more going up in the coming years. We will put more satellites into space in the next 5 years than in all of human history combined. That will allow us to connect everything and everyone everywhere using access to these satellite networks. So let's figure out how we can use these in Oregon to be able to connect people in more remote and rural environments and ensure they have the advantages that come with access to high-speed internet bandwidth. Which takes us to my thoughts on what does this mean for our state? Here's 5 thoughts on things that we need to do, strategic things we need to invest in to make sure that we come out of this far stronger than perhaps we went into it. So first of all, we need to have affordable broadband for everybody. what this pandemic has illustrated is that having a high-speed broadband connection makes a huge difference in the quality of our lives, not just for watching Netflix, but for connecting our kids so they can do remote learning when they need to at school, for connecting people to information about jobs, to allowing them to work successfully remotely, to have access to healthcare services through remote healthcare services. It used to be that we only thought about connecting communities physically to resources, making sure that there were bus routes where people could make their way to hospitals, to doctors' offices, making sure that they could get to a place of work in a reasonable way. We've got to keep doing that, but in addition to that, we have to make sure that it's easy for people to get to healthcare services, to place of work digitally, and that means affordable broadband for everybody. Second thing is, I've chosen to live in this state now for 23 years. And I do that because it has amazing assets. I live in downtown Portland. I love the incredible restaurants here. I love going out to wine country because that's my thing. I'm British. We drink wine. It's what we do. There's so many things about this whole state that make it so compelling to live here. Incredible hiking, natural resources, being able to go and bike, go and ski, the great people that are here. We have these incredible resources. Let's figure out what those things are, amplify what makes us great, and market it to the rest of the world. Because one way to bring money into the state of Oregon is to increase our tourist business and make it more attractive. Portland has certainly taken a few punches in the eye recently in terms of our PR perception, and we're going to need to do some work around that. But we have some great assets here. Let's never forget that. And use those assets to attract these anywhere workers. There's plenty of people who are desperate to get out of the Bay Area and move somewhere else and bring their skills and their earning potential, perhaps to Oregon. Let's find ways to attract them here, make them welcome, make them comfortable, help them spend their dollars in our economy. There are many companies looking, with the disruption in supply lines that happened as a result of COVID, looking to reshore manufacturing, to bring it back from China in particular. We're competing with all the other 50 states. So this is not something that's unique to Oregon, but let's figure out ways we can at least get a piece of that pie and bring people back here to do advanced manufacturing, to embrace 3D manufacturing, and so on. And finally, we need as a society to make it cheaper to get a high quality education, to make it easier to get a high quality education. The same technologies that I've talked about today, just very briefly, we know they are going to put some people out of work, and people will need to reskill and upskill to be able to continue to participate in the workforce. We need to have an education system that embraces those people and helps them quickly, easily, and cheaply gain the skills they need to continue to be part of the workforce. We need to use the same technologies that are putting people out of work, and that there will be some people that lose their jobs in the next 10 years, 15 years because of technology. Most of us, it will change the way we work, but not put us out of work. But use those technologies to retool education for the 21st century. It's essentially the same model we've had for 250 years. It's time to embrace and reimagine education for the internet age so that we can all have access to it at low cost. And some final thoughts for Oregon businesses. I mentioned earlier that technology can be scary, and particularly some of these very powerful technologies like artificial intelligence, augmented reality, blockchains, quite impenetrable technologies to understand at first. It is important that we all, as business leaders, as business managers, as employees of businesses, understand these technologies, boost our technology acumen. You don't need to know the bits and bytes of how they work, but what you do need to know is what kind of problems can you solve with them. So do what you can. There's all sorts of free resources online. You can go on YouTube and learn about this stuff. I wrote a book about it behind me here, The Innovation Ultimatum. But embrace this and learn about these technologies and what they could do for your business. Second thing is, make sure that you have invested so that you can deliver 100% digital journeys. What I mean by that is a digital customer journey. So everywhere from discovering about your company and what you offer, through delivering products and services, customer service, loyalty programs, all of that end to end. make sure you can do that digitally as well as in physical, in person, so that customers have a choice and so that you have resilience during difficult times. Similarly, you need to make sure you have, where you can, 100% digital employee journeys to give them that flexibility to work from home when they need to. Have a conversation, a strategic conversation about what's right for you, for your company, for your brand, on this question of being a remote first business or an office first business or somewhere in between. What does that look like for you over time? And define what your new norm is for you as a business, for your customers, for your suppliers, for your partners. What will the new norm look like going forward in 2021 and 2022? Because we're not going back to the way things were in 2020, so plan for the way things will be. And once you've understood that new norm, use innovation to innovate forwards. And if that matrix offered you as a helpful starting point for that, I hope that's the case. If this was a useful conversation for you, you're welcome to reach out to me and find me. This is my contact information. You can follow me on the Twitters and the LinkedIn and all that sort of stuff. That's my book if you're interested in it. I hope this was useful as a starting point to help you begin to think about things positively, and what we might be able to do as ways to invest and dig our way out of what has been quite a difficult time. So thank you for your attention. I hope this was useful today. Back to you, Joff.
Thank you, Steve. Fantastic, outstanding. I'm not sure what other words I could use to describe that. I think that I'm sure that a lot of leaders, that are running, small to medium to large size businesses, and you start to take a look at that list of things that we're all dealing with in some way, shape, or form. And for me, I think that the idea of anywhere workers has really been on the forefront and challenging as we look at how we built our businesses and the things like serendipity moments, which are we're missing that second conversation with our people, and that's where a lot of the ideas and the great challenges, great opportunities to meet people, so on and so forth, come together. And rethinking culture and rethinking how we do things has certainly been a challenge on my mind over the last 6 months, and one that is affecting not just our leaders but also our employees as we think about work of the future. So thank you for that, and so much of the other great content. The last thing you mentioned in your ideas for Oregon was to retool education for the 21st century, and I can't think of a person who's more on the forefront of that than our next speaker, Toya Fick. And Toya has had much to do with the improvements that have been made in our education system over the last 5 to 10 years. And as we all understand, we have much work left to do. And I think Toya is going to speak with us a little bit about that, and also look ahead to the future of some of the things that she's working on, not only with Stand for Children, but also Meyer Memorial Trust. So with that, I'd like to introduce Toya Fick.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Joff. And thanks, Steve, for your remarks. I'm excited to share some time with you all this afternoon. Like Steve, I would much rather be on a stage looking out at all of your smiling faces. And also like Steve, I am not a native Oregonian, and I have a little bit of an accent that will come out as I give my remarks today, but excited to talk about issues that are very near and dear to my heart. I'll start by saying that since COVID-19 shut down everything earlier this spring, I have found myself saying two things over and over almost every single day. And I'm sure others will agree with this first statement. The first one is, I wish someone would come to my house and teach my children. Distance learning is very interesting to do while you are also working full time. And I'll get into how my kids are responding to that and what we think we might be doing and moving forward to improve our system for all of our kids. But the second thing I say a lot, actually, is that I am so glad and so thankful that COVID-19 didn't happen when I was 19. And I'll tell you why in a second. We can go to the next slide. That's me in the bottom on the right. Hopefully you can see that. Right before I turned 19, it was during my senior year of high school. And I show you this picture because I want to paint a picture for you as to what's happening with a lot of our kids here in Oregon. At the time that picture was taken, my mom was a single mom. She worked 3 jobs. I also worked full-time after school and on the weekends to help support our family. And I shared the responsibility with my mom because I was the oldest of caring for my younger siblings. My youngest sibling was 6 years old at the time, so it was almost a full-time job on top of my full-time job. But the time between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. during the week was sacred because I was in school. I had to be in a physical school learning all day long. And as we know right now, that is not the case for any of our kids. Um, I was not working to support my family between 8 to 3. I was not caring for siblings. I was preparing for a future that gave me options. And so, as we think about what's happening with COVID-19 in our education system, really do think about the fact that our kids, that 8 to 3 time, 8 to 3:30 or whatever the school day was, no longer exist for kids in the same way that it did last year, the year before. It is very important for us to keep that in mind as we move forward, because I tell you that the only reason I'm not raising my kids in poverty right now is because I had those walls to protect me and protect my time and to prepare me for my future. So the implications of this is going to be astronomical, and we really need to think about what that will do for our kids as they prepare for their future and as our society prepares to receive them. So whether or not you have kids in school, you now know that we need our schools and other systems to work really well. And in fact, I would say our schools have to work better than before because poverty is having an impact on Oregonians and on kids like we've never seen before. I'm lucky, as Joth mentioned, to be able to address these issues in all my day jobs as the chair of the board at Meyer Trust and as the Oregon Executive Director at Stand for Children, but also as a mom. And that last title is my absolute favorite. We can go to the next slide. And now you can see why. I have two amazing, wonderful children. My son is now a first grader. My daughter is now a fifth grader. And we have learned a lot about each other in the last few months. I've been in awe of their resilience during this crazy time. They have soldiered through homeschool with mom. They loved school before COVID, but they have recently asked me if they could do homeschool with me indefinitely. No, that's not really an option for me, but I'm super excited that they love it. And I realized that it's because being at home gives them the space to be creative, which is their favorite thing about learning, having the space to create scenes for a new movie they're working on, or write a book, or sit and read a book, or draw pictures. Is really important. Like this picture behind my left shoulder here is really important for not just my kids, but for all kids to have that space to be creative. They are able to have that space because all of their needs are taken care of. They don't have to worry, like I did at 19, about working full time. They don't have to worry about whether or not the lights will be on when they come home from work or from school. They don't have to worry about being evicted. That was my childhood, and it made it really hard to learn. But again, I had that time, that protected time, to focus on the things I needed to have a brighter future. Now, imagine that every kid in Oregon had the space that my kids have to be creative. Imagine what that would look like for kids in terms of their ability to then log back on to Zoom at the appropriate time and receive the information they need to get from their teacher. We need to really be thinking about how we create this for kids as they move forward, because we know many kids don't have the same reality as the kids that I have and many of you have. And so we definitely need to be thinking about the consequences of those gaps, those opportunity gaps, especially on our shared future. I say a lot that COVID just exposed gaps that we already knew were there. And now those gaps have an implication on real life for everyday Oregonians, as opposed to not really thinking about them before. So let's turn to the next slide. We know that every student, no matter their situation, will experience learning loss this year. My kids have a really crappy teacher in me, but they are, and they're getting what they need, but they will also probably experience some learning loss. This A recent study done by McKinsey & Company found that the learning loss for kids in poverty will be twice as high as the overall student population. And for a lot of those reasons I pointed out earlier, kids are not able to log on to Zoom all day. Some kids had to figure out how to get broadband access to their home. I think Steve just talked about that very eloquently a few minutes ago. Again, poor kids will lose twice as much because perhaps their family needs them to work. Perhaps their family doesn't have food every day, 3 meals a day, 7 days a week for months on end. These are real life situations that our kids are exposed to and won't have the tools or the access to sit and learn all day like they used to when kids were going to a physical school. School has been a lifeline for so many kids, particularly kids in poverty. And this pandemic has cut off access to that lifeline. So I think that if we're going to create a recovery that provides a shared prosperity, we have to ensure our systems adapt to the moment that we're in and serve our kids very differently than they have before. There are three things we work on at Stand and at Meyer as well to help ensure that our systems are adapting and changing to make that happen. And if we turn to the next slide, I'll get into those three things. The first thing we have to do is ensure our families have the resources they need to pay their bills, right? To pay their bills and to put food on the table and to keep the lights on and to save for a rainy day. It would not be possible to even think about what life would have been like if the feds hadn't come in and said, okay, we'll give you an extra $600 a week to get through this time. It was a lifeline that was needed. So our kids and our families need to make sure that they have the resources and the tools right now to be successful. And sometimes that means supplementing income or making sure that the one job families have is enough to pay their bills. The second thing we must do is provide affordable housing. And it's something that we've been working on in Portland for quite some time. And it will only get worse if we take our eye off the ball. So affordable housing has to be, again, a top priority for the work that we do as a state. And then third, we need to make sure our schools are helping our families address the needs of their children right now. Not just make sure that, the lights are on, the buses are running, and that we have enough librarians, but to make sure that we are helping our families address the needs of their kiddos today, to make sure that kids have a future that gives them options. So when we do all three of these things, it's important that they are done in a way that acknowledges and accounts for and solves for racial disparities. We know too much now to ignore the fact that race plays a role in every single thing that happens in our society, from education to housing opportunities to economic prosperity. And so we cannot ignore that moving forward. So what does that look like and how do we work toward it? Turn to the next slide. As was mentioned, I am on the board at Meyer Trust, and we work in each of these areas over the last 5 years, and we're going to be turbocharging that work as we move forward. For the past 6 years, we've done our work with an equity lens, and our peers have come alongside of us and worked with us to ensure that they are asking the same questions that we're asking. Who are you serving? Who's on your board? Who's in positions of power at your organizations? And these are questions that we've pushed our grantees to answer, and they've responded really well, and many of our peers have done so as well. We've worked for the last 5 years with a really capital E equity lens. And the recent murders of Black men and women have really spurred us to go just beyond equity, but to sharpen our focus on racial equity. Because again, we know that a person's race impacts everything they can do in our society, and particularly in a place like Oregon. And we can't ignore this any longer. So we recently just announced the Justice Oregon Fund. It is a $25 million over 5 years, an initiative to address the needs of Black Oregonians specifically. It is our largest initiative to date, and we think it should be, given the racial history of our state when it comes to Black people. And so we're excited to learn a lot, to work with Black-led organizations and Black-centered organizations to improve the lives of families across our state. And we'll definitely use what we're learning to inform our regular grant making, which is about $35 million a year. And so we'll be announcing a lot of what we're hearing, what we're learning as we move forward. This work is very important to us. And I'll just take a second to plug efforts like the Black Resilience Fund that has raised about $1.5 million to be a rapid response for Black families throughout the state. And those needs have been incredible. And we've seen an outpouring of that over the last few months. And just kudos to the folks at the Black Resilience Fund for that. If you haven't heard of them, please Google them. It's definitely worth your time. And next slide, please. At STAND, we have partnered with organizations to give direct cash assistance to families in need. So in the early weeks of COVID-19, we delivered $1,000 to over 100,000 families across this country. We hoped those funds would be used to help put food on the table, to help keep the lights on, and to pay for the supplies needed to set up distance learning at home. It's not easy. It's not free to go out and set up your home to make sure that your kids have a space to learn. And we knew that families would have needs. We targeted folks that were already receiving food stamps and literally just deposited $1,000 into their accounts. And we heard from hundreds of families who were beyond thankful for these funds, many of whom had just been laid off from their jobs. One man sent us a video saying that he'd been laid off and was unable to work for 6 weeks. And he said that he was out of work because he was not essential. But this cash assistance showed him that he was essential, and it helped him keep his phone on, which he then used as a hotspot for his kiddo who was out of school, right? So really sort of that just-in-time supporting families, particularly as folks are being laid off, is super essential to make sure that we are preparing for a better, more prosperous future. You can learn more about that work at givedirectly.org. It's been great, and we're hoping to continue that work as we move forward. Next slide, please. We are also turbocharging our focus on racial equity and outcomes when it comes to education. In the past, we've done this with passing legislation or passing ballot measures that provide targeted investments outside of what's called the state school fund. And those things include like the Black Student Success Act and Measure 98 and the Student Success Act that we helped pass this last biennium. Those dollars have had an equity focus, and they are really specific in terms of their guidelines and what districts can use the resources for, because we wanted to make sure the dollars reach the kids, the dollars reach the programs that we knew would work to improve outcomes for kids. We hardly ever touched, though, the mainstream of funding that is provided by the state to do K-12 education, and that's called the State School Fund, and it's worth $9 billion. So right now we have $9 billion pouring in to our schools throughout the state to ensure that we pay for teachers and principals and superintendents and librarians and custodians and all the things that are needed to run schools. These funds are used by every single school district to pay for textbooks and to make sure that everything runs the way it should. However, we're not in school. So we need to be thinking about how those dollars are used differently as we move forward to help support families. One issue that we've heard a lot about is around creating pods for families, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I want to break down a little bit how education funding works before we go into that discussion. So we can go to the next slide. Oops, sorry, I lost my place here. So the State School Fund provides the vast majority of dollars in funding in Oregon. The things that we've been working on over the last few years have been great, but they're all on top of the State School Fund. And again, districts get resources based on the number of kids they have, but also depending on what kind of students are in their buildings, what kinds of students attend their schools. So if a student is in poverty, there's a little extra money for that. If a student is learning English, there's a little extra money for that, disabilities, so on and so forth. Those extra dollars amount to 11% of that total fund. It's about $1.1 billion of that $9 billion is given to districts because they have students who need additional support. But the fund does not require accountability. It's not flexible. It does not require funds to be spent directly on students that are in need, and therein lies the problem. It is why districts cannot be flexible and use dollars to help poor families navigate this system. It is why districts are not allowed to just take that money and say, well, let's help you create a pod families if you cannot afford it. And you have organizations like OMSI stepping into the fray to say, let's help our families get through this challenge. It is why we needed additional funds to ensure our kids have Chromebooks. We really need to think about the fact that our dollars are not very flexible, not used in a way that is accountable to our families and our kids. And it's because our dollars are really locked in as we go in from biennium to biennium, and we want to work to undo that. And we know that when we focus more on kids and not just the adults in the system, that we get better outcomes. And if we go to the next slide, we did this work a couple of years ago with a coalition of non-English speaking families. We pushed the legislature to pass a bill that required districts to focus on kids whose first language isn't English. They were getting additional dollars for those kids and not spending dollars directly on those kids. And so before 2015, the districts were allowed to just put their money in a general fund and see what happens, right? And we asked the state to really track the additional dollars going to kids whose first language isn't English. And from that point on, we have seen a dramatic increase in graduation rates for kids whose first language isn't English. In fact, their trajectory is far outpacing the rest of the state, only because we asked for a little transparency and accountability for funds. And so now we think we should be doing a lot more of that as we move forward, asking where dollars are going, looking at families that are impacted by poverty and making sure that we're supporting them as they move forward. Next slide. We need to do so in a way that acknowledges that race is a real roadblock. And so we're going to be asking the legislature to really think about how we can provide districts with resources when they're serving Black kids, when they're serving Native kids, when they're serving kids in poverty, and really focus those dollars on those students so that you are able to be flexible and nimble and not lock your money up for 2 years in a row without sort of thinking about how the world has changed before our eyes. And so we're hoping that this flexibility and accountability will move the needle forward without taking a ton of extra resources to do so. We have money in the system. We just need to make sure that we're using it differently and making sure those dollars go to vulnerable students. And the last thing I'll say about this is that we need to protect those resources from budget cuts and contract negotiations, because our kids' futures should not be bargainable. We should be thinking about how to make sure the dollars are accountable to our children and to our families in a way that serves them as we sort of move through this crazy once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. So as the last slide, we'll just say that I'm really excited to work with our colleagues across the legislature and in other associations and with you all as well, because again, this is our future workforce. You need these changes as much as we parents do. And so looking forward to working with you all together on that. And again, I'll just say thanks for having me. And I'm looking forward to additional conversation with Steve and Joth. Thank you.
Thank you, Toya. Thank you, Steve. So remember, I just want to remind everybody that I am not a professional, talk show host here. I signed up for this thing and I volunteered for it. So I'm going to do my best here to bring some key themes out of our talk, and feel free to take over if you're like, he's not doing the job, let him take over. But I want to start first on the connection between the 2 points. And one is education and workforce. And I think that between the work that Steve talked about with our future, and Toya, the things that we're working on today with our education platform, as we kind of look ahead here over the next 5-10 years and kind of where we're going, I think, one, I'm actually going to start with the outcome, which is the workforce. And I want to ask you, Toya, a question about what we can do in education today in doing that. And Steve, you talked about literally a new workforce. And I think we are all experiencing a new workforce that's unfolding in front of our eyes. We're experiencing the need to be very good with technology. We're experiencing the need to communicate differently. We're experiencing even the things that we don't even know what we need yet, with the future of where things are going. But as you think about companies and teams that are building the workforce of the future, where do you start? I mean, how do you think about the challenge and the scale that's in front of us? And you talked about digital, and we're talking about a massive shift of a system in a very short period of time. How do you think about getting our workforce better to be ready for the future?
I'll start and then kick it over to Steve. I think as soon as we get to a place where we can see each other again, we have to give kids experiential learning opportunities, right? Not just rely on the teacher in the classroom in front of the whiteboard to make sure the kids have the knowledge they need to be ready for your workforce. But internships, hands-on learning opportunities, we've done a lot of work in that space within our schools, but we really need our businesses to open up to show kids how businesses work and what kind of skills they need to be prepared for our future, right? That'll be hard to do until we are able to not be socially distanced, but that is one way that we know we've seen work in terms of improving outcomes and improving workforce readiness, giving kids real opportunities even before they graduate high school to get ready for that. But I loved what Steve said earlier about thinking about how we use this space to not just give kids the teacher that would normally be in front of them, but access to teachers all across the world, the best in the business, no matter where they are. I think we need to be thinking about what that looks like here in Oregon. So, those are my two quick answers. I'll kick it to Steve for more.
Great.
So a few thoughts. Well, I mean, the workforce of the future are going to be much more diverse, and not just in terms of the traditional metrics we might think of age and race and gender and background and culture, but we're also going to be working alongside machines. It's another thing for us to be thinking about is the workforce of 10 years from now, we will have non-human co-workers who'll be working alongside us, helping us get our jobs done. So we need to prepare people for a very diverse workplace where we're working alongside many different types of humans who are very different than us and very different in terms of the experience, because the big problems of the future that we'll be working collaboratively together in companies to try and solve, those problems will only be solved by people with very diverse expertise coming together. And if I give you an example, I mean, to build a self-driving car, you not only need your traditional petrochemical engineers and industrial designers and fabric designers and wind tunnel engineers and all of that, but you now need software programmers and artificial intelligence experts. You need philosophers and ethicists to help you make a decision, because these cars are going to have to make decisions that humans once had to make about what they do in the case of an accident. So it's a very diverse group of people together, and what you need in that to make that work is you need a culture of mutual respect, where people maybe don't know much about what the other people in their team do, but they have respect for it, and they know enough about what they do to have a meaningful conversation. So that, I'll give you an example. When I worked at Intel, seeing engineers work with social scientists who were trying to figure out what the experience of a self-driving car should feel like, and the engineers trying to code it. Each of them, the social scientists thought that the engineers were knuckle draggers, and the engineers thought the social scientists were foo-foo-la-la, people that shouldn't be listened to. And eventually they had to build respect for each other so they could hear each other, they could understand each other's language, and they could actually collaborate. So I think that's a big challenge for the workplaces of the future, is a very diverse workplace of mutual respect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you. So I want to kind of build off of that here for a second. And one of our key platforms with the business plan as we look ahead is broadband for all. And but Steve, you opened my eyes a little bit more to 5G availability versus satellite. Um, and Toya, I have to believe that broadband connection comes up in a conversation you have at some point or along almost every day. So the importance in both of your areas related to how do we bring these things together, and Toya, maybe the need of our communities related to broadband and what that means to them. But then Steve, maybe some of the challenges that we're not thinking about related to rural communities or communities that are harder to get to, just because of the networks that exist maybe in some of our bigger cities. Like how do we improve that? How do we move that forward based on some of the experiences that you're having today?
Yeah, I can't even tell you how essential broadband has become. It's a conversation we've had as with state policymakers for the last 6 months, and it's always been something that we want to have in schools. And I think our schools are better equipped as buildings rather than our homes. We've seen families go, drive up to the school and sit in the parking lot for a couple of hours just to have access to the Wi-Fi. That shouldn't be. And how is that possible if your parents are working multiple jobs, or if no one has reliable transportation, particularly in a rural area? It's harder to get to our schools, and it shouldn't be something that we, in 2020 are still talking about, whether or not we get to our kiddos. We now know we need it. I know it's hard to do, but it absolutely is necessary. And even within a family in town, I have two little people who have very similar schedules. And when they're on Zoom and I'm on Zoom, everybody's slow. There's glitches. The kids can't hear their teachers. There's lots of complaining, turning off their cameras to make sure the sound at least comes through. That shouldn't be in a day like today, right? Like it really needs to be a lot different, and we have to invest more to make sure our families have access to it, no matter where they live or how many kids they have on Zoom at the same time.
Absolutely. And Steve, how about your thought about that?
So, I mean, we've this digital divide has always been there, but we're at risk of it becoming much wider and really disenfranchising people who are living in rural communities and don't have access to not just the broadband. I mean, broadband is a piece of the puzzle, but they also need the devices to be able to access these services. And, the quality of education that a kid is going to get on a broadband connection on a nice big 30-inch iMac versus a kid who's on a low bandwidth connection trying to use a parent's smartphone is wildly different. So it's broadband, it's the devices, and it's the services that are delivered over the top of them. And there's training and support so that people know how to use them, and that the people delivering services feel comfortable and know how to use them. I mean, any parent that has been thrown into figuring out how to educate their kids magically at home, think about the teachers who also were dropped into magically having to suddenly know the best way to deliver education in distance learning. It's not fair. I mean, we had to do it because out of necessity, but training teachers, helping them to be able to be successful, to do distance learning. Because of COVID, some regulations were relaxed in the healthcare sector to enable telehealth to be reimbursed by insurance agencies, but also for us to do it across state lines. It was illegal to do that, which is just stupid. If you're on holiday somewhere in a different state, you couldn't contact your doctor with telehealth if you were out of state. Crazy. So we need to continue to knock down these regulations to make this stuff accessible, train clinicians on how to use this stuff effectively so that we can, be able to deliver these services to people remotely. And for any educators that are listening who find this idea scary, or who say, hey, we tried distance learning, it was a disaster. It's proof that the way we do things today is exactly the way we should continue to do it, as we have done for the last 250 years. Let me say this to you. It is time to embrace fresh thinking. You give a great product, you have a great service, but it is not accessible to enough people in this country because it's too damned expensive. And I have challenged the universities in Oregon about this and said, you've got to figure out how to cut the cost of delivering a quality education in half. And when you do that, figure out how to cut it in half again And oh, we couldn't possibly do that. Well, of course you can't do that if you continue to deliver education in the way you do it today. The model just doesn't work. But if you embrace technology, completely rethink it, you have a chance. And the challenge I give you this is, what's better? Do you want to embrace fresh thinking and new business models? Or do you want to have this happen to you? Right? So it's a question of, do you want to have this happen to you or because of you? It's much better to do change under your own steam.
For sure.
So let me play.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Toya. Yeah, no, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I'll just add to that. I was thinking along the same lines in terms of universities. Our universities need to step up also and help prepare our teachers for what's facing them. I don't know if their curriculum is changing. I'm hoping that it is, because I think we're moving to a place where just standing in front of a classroom of kids is not going to be the norm, and making sure that all of our educators are prepared for using some sort of distance learning, if it's not full-time, half-time, part-time, whatever. The variation that I'm seeing in my own two kids in terms of their teachers being ready for it is interesting. So yeah, making sure our universities are preparing teachers for what might be coming ahead of them would be really important for our districts and universities to do together.
And you're right, we have great universities in Oregon. I worked with Southern Oregon University, with PSU, with OSU. There's some great people there who really get this, particularly Southern Oregon University are really trying to embrace this and figure out, how do they support the workplace of the future? How do they not just double down on the STEM teaching, which people think, well, the future must be STEM. That's part of it. But almost paradoxically, helping people to develop the skills that machines will never have, that make us uniquely human. Collaboration, creativity, communication skills, creative thinking skills, critical thinking skills. The things that liberal arts universities actually teach and teach well. We're going to need lots of those for the workplace of the future. So there's a place for all these universities. I think the delivery model just needs to be really looked at closely.
Absolutely.
So when you let's take that whole package of topics that we just had and let's talk about broadband for the workforce. So now if we can work it into schools, work with our education system, work with our universities to improve their delivery. Now we need to attract manufacturing. We need to bring telehealth to everyone that have the availability to get it. Again, attracting those broadband connections and satellite connections into some of the smaller parts of our state. What are the challenges that are ahead of us to make that happen? I think the education system, we have a pretty good lane of at least understanding, or hopefully understanding, where we need to go. How do you think about attracting business? And Steve, I'll throw that to you first. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, so once you have these high-speed connections, and the good news is they just kind of happen for the satellite networks, because the networks are attractive to large financial institutions. So think your Goldman Sachs, those types of companies, because they're trying to connect their trading desks in New York and London with as fast a connection as possible. And it turns out it is faster to send a signal up to a satellite through the vacuum of space and down to another base station in the UK than it is to send it in a fiber optic cable that goes underneath the Atlantic Ocean. So there's a lot of interest in these networks for these gigantic financial companies. They will largely fund getting all these satellites into space, and then the rest of us get to take advantage of them. So to tap into these networks, you'll need an antenna the size of a pizza box, if you believe what Elon Musk says. And then from that, you could then spray out 5G locally or Wi-Fi locally, so you can start to connect all these communities. So that part should generally take care of itself. Once you can connect businesses to these high-speed connections anywhere, particularly for manufacturing, as you mentioned, Joff, you can start to rethink the way you deliver manufacturing. So especially as you embrace additive manufacturing, also known as 3D printing, you can get to an era where a small business in Oregon could compete on a global scale, or at least a national scale. So think about the way that you use Kinko's today, right? If you want to print something at Kinko's, you can upload the file on the web, they print it, and you go and pick it up, or they'll ship it to you. The same thing should be true for manufacturing in the future. So that if you want something, you upload the design file, you put the bid out to compete. A great Oregon manufacturer picks that bid up, bids on it, wins the bid, creates that object and ships it where it needs to go. The opportunity for Oregon to compete on a global scale should be like it's never been before.
Great. Toya, anything to add to that?
No, I'll just say that to create that, I feel like you need people who can have the space and time to be creative. So it's back to my original premise in terms of what I've learned with my kids. That creativity is what we need in all of our kids and all of our workforce to understand where the future, the possibilities of the future. So I am hoping that our districts and our education system looks a lot different because we've really thought about how to create the space and time for kids to not just sit at a desk and watch the Zoom all day or sit in the classroom and watch a teacher all day, but to really work together to create and to use their brains a little bit differently. So we're hoping that will happen in our future.
All right, we are about out of time, so I'm going to give you each 1 minute for a final comment. Toya, we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, we've been talking for a long time, as long as I've been in education and well before, about the need to rethink how we do education, to shake things up quite a bit. And now is that time. From the calendar that has been created and used for hundreds of years, which never made sense to people, to what time school starts for high schoolers. I think it is really time that we start to think about what hasn't worked, how we fund it differently, and be creative about what needs to happen in the future for our kids. And so I'm looking forward to working with teachers unions and our superintendents and all the folks involved in this system to really sort of put down what we know about education in terms of how it's been going and how it's happened over the last 100 years, and really reimagine and rethink what the future can hold for our K-12 system. And it will take all of us to do that together. So I'm looking forward to that.
Fantastic. Steve.
So I talked earlier about COVID being the great defroster. And I think we all need to defrost our own thinking. We need to allow ourselves to embrace new ideas, embrace new ways of doing things. And over the next, let's say, year, as we dig our way out of the current times and start to build a foundation for the next decade in Oregon, let's listen to our own language. And if we hear words like, we can't do that because, just pause, just stop and step back and go, oh, did that just come out of my mouth? That should be a signal to reevaluate what you just said, because we need radical change and we need to embrace systematic change in some cases. And that's really hard. It's really uncomfortable. But I think if anything has been illuminated in the last, 8 months of misery that we've had as we've been packed up inside our own houses, things aren't great. And while we are in a great state with incredible resources and wonderful people, it is time to think about doing some fundamental things in very different ways. And that's going to take us all to get uncomfortable and to do things that are way outside of our comfort zone, and to have a bit of faith, to say, I'm going to make a leap and try something different and try wholeheartedly to embrace that. If we can all do that, then I'm really optimistic about Oregon's future. I love living here. I've been made to feel so welcome, and I was so pleased to be able to talk today because I'm part of a wonderful state, and I'm proud to be an Oregonian, and I'm very optimistic about Oregon's future if we can all come together and do things differently.
Thank you. Steve Brown, Toya Fick, thank you for being our guest today. So much for sharing your knowledge, and I can't personally wait to be part of your journeys of the things that you've laid out, and speaking on behalf of everybody at the Oregon Business Plan. So thank you for that.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
Well, two fantastic speakers that if your head isn't spinning or thinking a little bit more about the things that we can do, you might have napped a little bit there along the way. So really, Steve lays out just great promise for, future thinking, future ideas, but one that I think from a timeline standpoint, I think these things are going to be accelerating faster than we know. I think the acceptance of change, the acceptance of new ideas, the acceptance of new opportunities across everything we discussed with Toya and Steve. The nature of how we sit in the community and just the year that we've had. I think we've never seen more of an opportunity for people and more for a way for people to stand up and say, I want to help. And I want to be a part of this change. And I think we can all agree that there's so much to be done. I think that the key with any good plan, though, if you look at a plan that's 3 years out, that's 5 years out, that's 10 years out, we need to be organized. We need to be together. We need to ask questions for understanding. We need to create accountability for our leaders, for our community members to execute and execute well. Not just get it done, but execute well in a way that provides a great future for our kids, for our workers, and introduces Oregon to hopefully many new people that want to live, work, and play here. So thanks again for Steve and Toya for coming. And before you go, I want to finish on just reminding you of where we are related to the Oregon Business Plan and our theme of shared prosperity. As you think about shared prosperity, we believe there are 3 pillars of our work that the state should pursue. We need to grow, create, and attract good jobs. Number 1, end of story, need that to happen. Number 2 is we need to help Oregonians to transition to jobs of today and the future. That's going to be paramount in front of us. And I think as you see the look at the millions of new companies that are being started today and what those jobs will be, we also need to prepare for skill sets to work in those jobs. And number 3, we need to reform institutions and invest in communities to support economic mobility. As the work that's being done around racial justice, around equity in our state, across all people of color, we have to pour into that and do a great job in every county, every city, and across the entire state of our geographies. During the fall season, we'll be exploring steps to advance all of these pillars with the aim of bringing forward a set of proposals for your consideration at our December 14th event. Please put that on your calendar, as we're excited about that, and we'll bring you some exciting ideas that have come out of these sessions and work that we're doing behind the scenes with state leaders and several leaders of our businesses in all counties of our state. We've scheduled sessions for 1 pillar to spark conversation, identify opportunities. Our next session on job creation will be held on October 13th. We will be joined by Christian Kettles from the Harvard Business School. He's a visiting executive, along with Robert Smith with Vista Equity Partners. He's a chairman and CEO of that business. Excited to have both of them join us around economic strategy and where we're headed for the future. On October 21st, we'll do a session on workforce strategy and maybe even expand on some of the ideas that Steve discussed today. And then finally, we'll do a session on economic mobility and where we're headed there, and we'll wrap it with the strategy on December 14th. So lots of work to do, and we know that everyone has a different day in front of them today, whether you've been hit by COVID, whether we have been working through racial equity and social injustice within our communities or our workforces, whether we have dealt with the fires and work with the health of our communities, the destruction of many of our small towns on the western slopes of the Cascades, or in Southern Oregon, where we saw Phoenix and Talent, basically be decimated by the fires. A lot of work to do, and a lot of ways for us to band together to help each other and to help our future. So I know that the state, broadband providers, schools, businesses, and community groups are working hard on this every day, and let's declare this a strategic priority. And what I mean by that is let's declare working together And more importantly, and very specifically, let's get broadband and satellite out there for all. Let's take this notion seriously. Let's move it forward as a priority of the state. And if we can get those moving, we can start to help our healthcare systems. We can work on creating more jobs. We can help the flexibility of our education system and the needs of our kids for the future. We can bring so many things to our rural communities, our metro communities, and communities all across every corner of our state to make this a better state. And if we can get broadband moving and make it a key priority right away, we will improve the lives of many. So that's my soapbox. Thank you to all for joining us today. Thank you for taking the 90 minutes of your day to be a part of this. And hopefully you can join us on October 13th as we discuss economic strategy. So let's work together. Let's do what we do in Oregon. Let's bring people together. Let's rise above this and make it a stronger place for the future. Have a great day.